I have a long list of thank yous that I'm going to save for the opening or for the 4 o'clock talk. For now, I'd like to introduce you to some Wright State students that have done some great work on the literature of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. First I'll talk a little bit about the class, and then I'll introduce the 2 students. This past spring, some 24 students and I spent 15 weeks studying 7 winners of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in a course called The Literature of Conflict. As the course went on, we developed a running conversation that was stunning in its depth and care. All the students worked hard to mull over complicated works from Richard Bausch, Chiang-Rae Lee, Maza Mengistu, Marlon James, Chimamanda Adichie, Junot Diaz, and Ben Fountain. Attending to these works' literary form, historical context, narrative voice, and syntax, we developed fascinating ideas about how these texts treated unbearable violence, dislocation, the unreliability of memory, and the greed, ignorance, and prejudice that breed violence from Texas to Nigeria to Jamaica to New Jersey. The 2 students presenting here represent the best work of the course. Each of their papers developed a sharp, well-researched reading of one of the works, and each helped me see these works in a new way. I'm excited to hear them present today, and I'm proud to see their work gracing the halls outside this theater. If you haven't seen the research posters that are outside this theater, I encourage you to check them out. They're really great. I should also say it's probably one of the best courses I've ever taught at Wright State. I don't know if it was the particular group of students or the question involved, but it was really just really great, lively, sharp, critical conversations throughout that course. So please join me. We have Deb Rushello and we have Hayat Ahmad. So please join me in listening to their articulate, thoughtful accounts of the literature of conflict. So we'll start with Deb.
Well, hi. As he said, my name is Deborah Rushlow, and I'm going to be giving a talk on the themes of portrayal of orphans from the Korean War in The Surrendered by Chiang-Rae Lee. Give me a minute, I have a PowerPoint for you all. All right. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about the Korean War orphans as they're represented in this novel. Now, one of the reasons I chose this topic for my paper is because of the many adopted families that I know in my personal life. Some of those adoptions have gone very well, and unfortunately some of them have gone not so well due to the past traumas that the children have experienced. So I was really inspired by reading this book because of the portrayal it has of the utter devastation and violence and trauma that Korean War orphans experienced. So to start out, other critics have observed that have observed the violence that the novel represents, specifically in its character of Jun Han, who is the main character, a Korean War orphan. She's been described as vengeful, possessing a complicated personality, and a frightening determination to survive by any means necessary. All these descriptions suggest a violent child, one whose aggressive nature directly contrasts the misconceptions prevalent among Americans during the Korean War era that Asian children are docile and submissive. Here we get into the research that I did into this project. I was interested in why orphan adoption was so popular during this time and what Americans thought when they were adopting children. So in doing that, I found this prevalent theme of Asian children being portrayed as docile and submissive, and the harm that came from that. So The Surrendered manifests a misconception of the docile and submissive child in the form of Mr. and Mrs. Stoles, an American couple whose plans to adopt 6 Korean orphans are as ambitious as they are misguided. It furthermore contradicts the misconception in the character of June, the violent and aggressive orphan that Stoles wish to adopt. In doing so, the novel uses the exchange of experience. This was a quote from one of the papers that we read during the class by Walter Benjamin, contrasting different forms of storytelling in different ways that we, translate and express experience, being one of them being storytelling experience shared person to person, as contrasted specifically, as we'll look in this essay, with the press and how the press represents violence in very different ways. So first, let's take a look at the historical context of the novel, because this is very important, particularly the myth of docility. So here you have a picture that would be typical of the way that Korean War orphans were represented in the media as very, bright and smiling and very happy, very willing to be adopted. Pictures like this appeared in newspapers during the time as the press promoted the adoption of Korean War orphans. It was actually, one of the biggest adoption programs in the history of the United States. So these campaigns often depicted orphans as in need of saving, feeding off the misconception that Asian children are docile and submissive, needing help. These portrayals were meant not only to inspire Americans to help these, poor orphans, but also to stir up American pride, because obviously during the Cold War, contrasting America as this bright symbol of being able to help the rest of the world. So that was also playing into political ideals during this time. So, in short, campaigns reminded Americans of their own view of themselves as responsible for saving the orphan child from a life of misery and suffering. The desire to save, while noble, proves just another embodiment of the misconception that Asian children are docile and submissive, as it posits the children as helplessly dependent on their American saviors, to whom they will gratefully submit. In light of the historical backdrop of the surrendered, the Stoleses, a couple of characters in the novel, manifest this misconception quite well, in that the couple arrives at the orphanage with the intention of taking home as many orphans as they could manage. This is a direct quote from the novel. So very ambitious, very, big-hearted, wanting to help, but also maybe a little unrealistic in their ambitions. This gesture, while generous, illustrates their assumption that these Asian children will be docile and submissive, ready and willing to receive instruction. That's a quote from the OED of the definition of docility. So Mr. Stoles directly asserts his dominance over the submissive orphan, June, while he presumptuously declares that he and Mrs. Stoles will be adopting June before even asking her permission in this matter. So he just goes and declares, "We're adopting you," and assumes that she'll be very happy about this. He says, "We're going to take 6 of you. We have plane tickets for 6." So they actually already bought these tickets in advance. Later, still without seeking June's consent in the matter, he matter-of-factly explains that June will be the oldest. You'll be helping with translating, among other things. There'll be some chores, naturally. His assumption of both June's acceptance of the offer and his expectation that she and the other children will work further belies this expectation that these Asian children will be docile in the ready to receive instruction sense. Even Mrs. Stoles, the wife of the farmer that's going to be adopting June, while acknowledging the need for June's consent to the adoption plans, illustrates her expectation that June be docile through her actions. In one scene, June breaks down sobbing, remembering the trauma of her past, something we'll get into a little later in the essay. Mrs. Stoles asserts control with maternal authority, embracing June and declaring, "It'll be fine now," as if June's trauma could be so easily managed through so dismissive a comment as "it'll be fine." So here we have a picture of a real-life couple from the time. interesting picture. They actually are adopting these children that you see without ever having met them. They never traveled to Korea. They never knew them previously before adoption. So in contrast to the idealized stereotype of the docile and submissive Asian child, Lee's novel portrays its orphan protagonist, June, as assertive and violent. Here again, Lee's relentless commitment to depicting violence as experienced by Korean orphans counteracts the politicized stereotype of the Asian child. June is aggressive, ambitious in her plans to survive, and confident of her ability to carry them out. From the first chapter, we see her determination to survive by any means necessary. This is a quote from a literary critic about June. Whether by abandoning her siblings, jumping onto a moving train, or, in many occasions, through violence. In an early scene, June responds to a threat from a farmer by biting his forearm. Later on, at the orphanage, June gains a reputation for getting into fights with the other orphans, at the end of which her counterpart invariably ended up with the more injured party. So a very, very violent child. Lee's somewhat gruesome depictions of June's violent behavior contrast sharply with the politically motivated tendency of the American media to portray the Asian children as docile and submissive, again, going back to the picture we saw at the beginning of very smiling in a school setting. This belies the novel's disenchanted sensibilities. This is one of the terms we worked on a lot in this class, the idea of enchantment being, as literary critic Sarah Cole writes, there is a strong impulse in literary accounts of violence to insist on the resonant, elemental, often painful bodily experiences. This is what's known as the disenchanted view of violence, not trying to make it noble or something higher, but presenting it for the very painful experience that it is. So we see this obviously in the examples of June biting a farmer's forearm, as well as in other events throughout the novel. So another telling one actually is her response to the Stolz's attempts to assert control over her by declaring their plans for adoption. She actually stomps on Mr. Stolz's foot to express how she feels about that idea. So these descriptions of June's violent actions all emphasize the small but painful damage she routinely inflicts to assert her will, all contributing to the novel's disenchanted view of violence, in contrast to the violence-free stereotypes of Asian children. The novel's plot and structure actually reinforce June's assertive and violent nature. The nonlinear structure reveals the results of June's most assertive action early on, as we know from the early descriptions of her life in New York City that she will not be adopted by the Stolzes, but will maintain her independence, never giving up on her fantasy of being adopted by Sylvie, the orphanage worker to whom she has become attached. So backing up there, the novel actually opens up with June living in the States on her own, an adult woman, so we know that she will, in fact, make it out of these circumstances, at least physically, to say nothing of mentally, the trauma that she's endured. So also another theme running throughout this novel is June's desire to be adopted by this woman that she's become very attached to, Sylvie, who's an orphanage worker at the orphanage where June is. So June so desires to assert control over her future that for a time she forgoes the violence in order to win over Sylvie, telling herself to keep disciplined, remake herself along the lines of an entirely different girl, someone who is not an orphan at all and not lost anyone in her life, much less witnessed any horrors or degradation. So again, this is describing June's thought processes of wanting to be adopted by this American woman and the lengths she's willing to go through, even denying the trauma that she has seen. In essence, making herself into the docile and submissive child that the American media portrayed as the ideal that Americans would want to adopt. So in effect, June attempts by power of will to overcome the violence of her past and remake herself. The Stolz's attentions to adopt her, however, derail her plans, driving her back to the violence as her most reliable means of asserting control over others. So again, when the Stolzes come and declare their intentions to adopt her, she goes back to stomping on feet and being very violent in order to assert her will. So the last 100 pages of the novel illustrate June's return to her violent nature as she continues to assert control over others' lives, over her own life, by manipulating others through violence in its various forms, pushing around the other orphans, sexually harassing Hector, another character in the novel, even violence against her own body in the form of voluntary starvation. Just a few of the examples of things that orphans sometimes face. So in this way, the novel reveals through the exchange of experience, again going back to Benjamin's idea of exchanging personal stories and experience as opposed to media portrayals, how June achieved through assertion and violence, not docility and submission, the life situation we find her in at the beginning of the novel. The novel's structure exemplifies the power of the storytelling to counteract the political power of the press, arranging instances of violence to best illustrate the experiences of violent orphan June, and so most effectively contradict the misconception of Asian children as docile and submissive. Interestingly, the incident with the Stolzes appears late in the novel, far removed from the violence of the first chapter, which so shaped June, turning her from the shy and soft-spoken girl she was before the war into the violent and aggressive orphan who contradicts the docile stereotype. So again, another scene very near the beginning of the novel involves the farmer and biting his arm, jumping onto a train, very violent, traumatic experiences, but these are very far removed from how we see her interacting with the Stolzes. By distancing the violent parts of June's past from her experiences at the orphanage, the novel allows the reader to almost separate June's character from her violent memories, much as adoption campaigns tried to separate the violent war orphans experienced from the American expectation that they be docile and submissive. The scene with the Stolzes, however, effectively breaks down this separation, illustrating the violence June has experienced continues to overshadow her life. So in one telling scene, when June actually sees the Stolzes for the first time, here the narration is diving into her thoughts, thinks they were probably country people, small-town citizens like those in the village where she had grown up. A tide of longing unexpectedly washed over her, this longing for the days before her father yielded to his demons and retreated to his study, longing for her mother's proud face, longing finally for her 2 brothers and 2 sisters who could not even stand here as she did. So again, she's lost her entire family in this war. Her brothers and sisters witnessed them dying. So in seeing the Stolzes, this actually brings out in her the violence that she experienced several hundred pages ago in the novel. Through letting us experience June's thought process, these few short lines instantly recall the violence of several hundred pages ago. After this timely reminder of June's violent past, June's own violent outbreak against Mr. Stolz seems not only justified, if not justified, then understandable. Most importantly, this experience of June's thoughts privies us to information the Stolzes, for all their politically fueled misconceptions, lack. How the violence June has experienced has turned her into a violent individual herself, strong-willed, assertive, and not easily managed by anyone. So again, you can understand where the Stolzes are coming from, being fed by these media ideas of what they expect from these Korean War orphans. However, in reading this novel, we are exposed to the truth of the trauma that she has endured, and so we can better understand her violent outbursts. A novel like The Surrendered, inspired by the violent experiences of very real people, promotes understanding of people who have experienced violence. Here we have a quote from Lee actually talking about the writing of this novel. It was actually inspired in part by some of the experience of his father who lived in Korea. So Lee writes, "The truth of the matter is the things that my father has seen, that I'll never see, thank God, give a depth and a scale of soulfulness that I never had to deal with." So here in the slide you can see this is written kind of in a handwriting scroll on a piece of paper to reflect, again, the contrast between written accounts, storytelling, personal narratives, and the media, and these mass-produced pictures and stories that are very far removed. So very much what the critic Benjamin would contrast, storytelling being a more authentic expression of experience, especially violent experience. So through the character of June, The Surrendered refutes the misconception that Asian children are docile and submissive. It furthermore disenchants violence in illustrating the resonant, elemental, often painful bodily experiences that accompany it. Lee may have written The Surrendered in part to better understand the stories of his father. However, in unflinchingly portraying the experiences of war orphans, experiences which contradict the politicized misconceptions so pervasive during the Korean War era, he facilitates understanding of the many orphans whom the war continues to affect. Thank you.
So yeah, now we have Hayat Ahmad. Look forward to hearing your paper.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And I wrote my paper about The Book of Night Women by Marlon James. And it's a book about slavery in Jamaica during the late 18th century. And I was very interested in this book because it speaks about a topic, slavery, that isn't discussed often in school, and it speaks about it very honestly. There's no sugarcoating it. It's just very, very brutal and graphically illustrated at times. And I think in a time such as when, for example, in certain textbooks like McGraw, where slaves are called migrant immigrants, I believe it's very important to remember it had the past accurately. Now, I am taking direct quotes from the book, and part of it is written in broken English, and there are some curse words and racial slurs, so I apologize in advance for my language. All right. The Book of Night Women, the disenchantment of violence and the circularity of slavery. Many people argue that violence is an irrevocable part of human nature and an unavoidable part of life. Others, though, debate whether violence is ever necessary or justified, even during times of war or conflict. In his 2009 novel, The Book of Night Women, Marlon James entertains this question in depicting one of the most notorious, heinous, and violent institutions in the history of mankind, slavery. The Book of Night Women tells the tale of Lilith, a mulatto girl conceived from a violent rape, growing up on the Montpelier sugarcane plantation in 18th century Jamaica. Lilith is nearly killed after she defends herself from an attacker and stabs him in the process. But the house slave, Homer, saves her and arranges for her to work alongside her, and she attempts to recruit Lilith into the secret group of night women who wish to start a slave revolt, to no success. Lilith instead is eager to gain the attention of Master Humphrey, the master of the plantation. However, after she spills hot soup on one of his guests, he orders her to be whipped every day for her impudence, and she is only spared after her white father demands that the whippings be stopped. She is then sent to an even more violent plantation, Culebra, where Master Humphrey's lover, Isabel, lives with her family. One day, when the master threatens to kill Lilith, she drowns him in his bathtub and then sets the entire house on fire to get rid of the evidence, killing everyone else except Isabel inside. Lilith then returns to Montpelier, where she becomes a house slave and romantically involved with the Irish overseer Quinn. Homer conducts the slave revolt against Lilith's warnings, and hundreds of lives are lost, including Quinn. In the end, Lilith remains a slave, and all the slaves involved with the revolt are tortured and killed. James goes into gruesome details with his portrayals of brutality, torture, and sexual violence before, during, and after a gruesome failed slave revolt. In doing so, he disenchants the violence, and these characters have to experience every day of their lives. Literary critic Sarah Cole defines disenchantment as the act of stripping away of idealizing principles and insistence that the violated body is not a magical site for the objection of culture. By this, Cole means that the violence is neither glorified nor romanticized. Instead of eliciting feelings of admiration or excitement, the violence elicits confusion, disgust, and sadness, with the realization that characters with emotions and aspirations of their own are the ones suffering through these horrific acts, as opposed to just unnamed bodies with no past or future. Though James disenchants nearly all acts of violence committed in the novel, whether committed by slave owners, Lilith, or slaves during the revolt, he implies that this violence is repetitive and circular and leaves it ambiguous as to whether or not said violence can ever truly end. The Book of Night Women examines a specific brutal form of slavery that was practiced in Jamaica before 1834. The British colonized Jamaica in 1655, and they quickly began using African slave labor to grow a variety of crops. Sugarcane became the most common and profitable crop over time. Though other countries have a deep history with slavery, including the United States, Jamaica featured notoriously violent and inhumane forms of slavery. Due to the combination of backbreaking work of growing sugarcane as a crop, as opposed to a crop that is less demanding, such as cotton or tobacco, malnutrition, poor diet, and cruel treatment, there are a large number of miscarriages, and the slave mortality rate was often twice as high as the birth rate. The average lifespan for a Jamaican slave working on a sugarcane plantation was 7 years. In fact, slaves were dying so rapidly that the Caribbean slaves experienced continuous decrease in population, and the North American slaves experienced continuous increase. While many slave populations in the U.S. grew by a higher number of births than deaths, many Jamaican plantation owners simply purchased new slaves when their previous ones expired. Prior to 1807, abolitionists contrasted Africans' burgeoning slave population with the failure of slaves to reproduce in the West Indies, citing later as evidence of a cruel regime perpetuated by the ready availability of fresh African imports. In response, planters argued that the Caribbean's harsh climate and the sexual immorality of Africans raised mortality rate while depressing fertility. The cruel treatment and daily violence of slavery as practiced in the Caribbean often inspired revolts over the centuries, with the Haitian Revolution being one of the most notable. Literary critic Evan Andrews describes the Haitian Revolution as being the most successful slave revolt in rebellion history. Not only did the revolt end with the founding of an independent state and new country, but it also served as inspiration for countless other revolts through the United States and the Caribbean. The Haitian uprising became a symbol of slave resistance for both slaves and slave owners, and inspired several similar attempts in Jamaica as well. In fact, it is this very revolt that will serve as inspiration for the slave revolt at Montpelier at the end of the novel. James goes to great lengths to describe the violence and pain slaves have to suffer through. At Montpelier, Lilith is strung up and whipped for several days for spilling soup on a guest at the party. She is whipped for hours at a time until the whippers tire themselves out and have to take turns to avoid damaging their wrists. When Master Humphrey watches the whippings, he is completely indifferent to her screams and the deterioration of her body. It is only when her white father, Jack Wilkins, tells them to stop that she is freed from her daily punishment and sent to Culebra, a site where the seemingly impossible happens. The violence of Montpelier is amplified. At Culebra, a young slave named Sacco is strung up, covered in honey, and tortured for bringing flowers into the house that made the mistress sneeze. There be Sacco, writhing and shaking and yelling into the gag, him feet, back, chest, and cocky, all covered in black ants. They traveling all over him body and biting every inch. Honey on the skin, ants in the day, mosquitoes in the night. Deltramina, the head slave at Culebra and the master's main target for sexual violence, is whipped to death after making the mistake of leaving the goat pen open. After Lilith sets fire to the house, the other innocent slaves are brutally tortured until they confess to killing the master and mistress, even though they were not involved at all. For the next 2 days, they strip all them niggers naked, wet their skin, and whip them with the cowhide. They spread her leg wide and brand her pussy. Then they do the same to the men's, branding their balls and their arsehole. Every nigger confess. The slave owners justify their actions by constantly reminding the slaves and each other that the slaves are inferior and deserve what they get in life, whether it be physical violence, the psychological indoctrination of the slaves' inherent inferiority and self-loathing, or sexual assault that they have to deal with often on a daily basis. The disenchanting violence is constant in these slaves' lives, stripping away all illusions of the romanticism of slavery and creating more weight and ominousness in the book's repeated question, "Every Negro walk in a circle, take that and make of it what you will." In the Book of Night Women, violence only leads to more violence as opposed to change or peace. Lilith has a long history of conflict and death as she grows up. In fact, literary critic Jim Hannon considers Lilith's first significant act as the murder of another slave who attempts to rape her. Lilith continues to be the target for violence. She is attacked more than once and eventually raped at Montpelier, and a source of violence as well. She kills Master Roger, and after she finishes with him, she kills Master and Roger after she smarts off to him because she knows very well that he will more than likely kill her. She kills the mistress who witnesses the death of her husband, and then Lilith burns down the whole house to get rid of any evidence, killing some slaves inside the house as well. Yet, after committing these acts of violence in order to save her own life, Lilith comes back full circle and works as a slave at Montpelier once more. The fact that she can kill her oppressors only to get moved to another plantation to be oppressed once more illustrates the fact that every Negro walks in a circle. And the circle is a never-ending cycle of violence and death. Lilith never fully comes to terms with what she did. She sometimes hallucinates that there's blood on her hands, hears the cries of children burning to death, or smells human flesh burning nearly at random. She also keeps seeing a dark woman that disappears almost instantly, and Lilith is unsure whether the woman represents evil, regret, a good omen, or a combination of sorts. Lilith tries to convince a fellow slave, Homer, not to go through with the revolt. "What you know about blood? Blood don't nothing but red. Whatever me do want get from the white man, me gettin' more. You still want blood. Me get my blood and see me here. Nothing different, nothing better. Revenge don't leave me nothing but them burning skin that can't blow out of my nose nor wash out." Lilith's mixed feelings about her past actions and the revolution in general reflect her depth and roundness as a character, something James says he learned from novelist Toni Morrison. It's not enough to give Lilith a terrible temper. The writer has to show the consequences of such a thing, good or bad. It would have been too easy to write a one-note character in a slavery novel. The topic is so contentious that I would have gotten away with it. But that would have been dishonest, and if there's one thing I've learned from women writers, it was to be brutally honest with female characters at the risk of people dismissing them as the very stereotypes they defy. Morrison taught me that it's not the actions that must be grounded in gut truth, but the emotions behind them. By this, James means that in order to create believable, real characters, their decisions and actions have to be based on believable, real emotions and motivations. When it comes to fiction, the truth has to be created from the experiences and the emotions of the characters and not the other way around. Lilith is such a rich, dynamic character with personality, emotions, and desires. Readers are reminded that these slaves are not property, but in fact people, and this further disenchants the violence that is committed against them on a daily basis. At the end of the novel, the slave revolt finally arrives, and James depicts it as brutal and thoughtless. She jump at him and swing the cutlass. It slice into him neck and blood bursts forth. McCluskey eye nearly pop out of him face. Callisto and two women's chop and chop and chop until three women's covered in blood. This act of violence sparks other slaves to join in, and the revolt spreads like wildfire. They shout for the Johnny Jumpers, but them niggers was already running. The Negroes in that section circle the men like the flood and swallow them up. They stop screaming, the Negroes still stomping and chopping. The Johnny Jumpers, the slaves that often help carry out whippings and torturing of other slaves, are not safe during this revolt. In the end, Lilith defends her old white father from other slaves, Lady Isabel, the lover of Master Humphrey, is raped, and many of the men trying to save the plantation die. However, not much changes. Master Humphrey has special cages built for treacherous slaves and has them tortured and die painful, slow deaths. Lilith, because she was loyal, remains a slave and is later raped by Master Humphrey. All of the original planners of the revolt die in one way or another, with no survivors who escape to freedom or even remain alive and enslaved. This gives the impression that no matter what they do, slaves cannot change their destinies, and that the gruesome violence during the revolt was all for naught. Every Negro walk in a circle, but sometimes the circle will not be the Negroes, but the white man own. Black man wake up and find circle make for him, beginning with the shackle that lock him round the neck. All the violence is disenchanted and goes without justification, even when committed in self-defense or in an attempt at freedom and change. If anything, such violence is condemned in Lilith's eyes, especially towards the end when she has a safe life living with the white overseer, Quinn, which explains why she's very reluctant to join the revolt. If Lilith were being tortured or forced to work in the cane fields, she would probably be more likely to join the revolt with a strong desire for freedom, and readers would be more likely to empathize even more with the revolting slaves. However, because Lilith is against the revolt, readers are more distant from motivations for the violence and therefore are more willing to condemn the revolt altogether. James's choice to have the revolt fail, with no survivors in the end, also shows that violence only begets violence and suggests the futility of revolution and the struggles for peace. Though, it was the ferocity and constant fear of slave revolts that often led to countries abolishing slavery, so there are times when violence can lead to peace. Even though the Book of Night Women won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for its candid description of the violence and atrocity of slavery, the book's condemnation of the slave revolt that was fought for freedom and peace makes readers question whether this peace is only acceptable when masters offer it to their slaves, as opposed to the slaves taking their fates into their own hands. If slaves never revolted and were fully complicit in the institution of slavery, would slavery still exist in Western countries and former colonies to this day? If the end result is peace, is violence ever truly justified? The Book of Night Women only promotes peace by revealing the evils of slavery and thus discouraging others from participating in this heinous institution. The book offers two vastly different messages. For the people of power, white slave owners, slavery is so horrible of an institution that it is unforgivable and doomed no matter what you do. For the people being oppressed, the African slaves, violence against the oppressors would only fail, put your lives in danger, and make life harder for the slaves that aren't executed in the end. This implies that only oppressors have the power to prevent slavery and violence, as well as ultimately end and abolish these practices, since the oppressed are disempowered and doomed to fail at obtaining freedom through violent means when more peaceful, diplomatic options are no longer available. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for a few questions. I'm told that you're supposed to repeat the question back when you hear it so that it gets recorded for posterity out there. Ben?
I was wondering if in the surrender it explores how age affects the influences of violence on a childhood. Like how if being younger or older changes how the violence impacts their experience.
Okay, so the question was, how does age affect, what age affect how violence is experienced? Or, okay. For the most part, most of the story and the very violent parts of the story take place when June is a child. There are other characters who are at varying ages experiencing violence throughout, so I would say that's a valid point that violence is experienced very differently. As far as the distinction between, I think the question is like the distinction between childhood violence and the trauma that inflicts as opposed to on an adult. Is that part of the question? I think it really portrays all trauma and violence as very negative, and you'd probably write a whole paper about differences in the trauma. So I would say that all of the characters in the book are so unique in the way that they experience trauma that it really just depends on each character.
Yes.
I'm Deborah. So the question was, did any of the papers or any of the books discuss how violence affects the perpetrator of the violence as opposed to the victim of the violence? And actually, I think Hyatt will probably talk about in the Book of Night Women as well. But both Lilith and June are very violent characters themselves. So you definitely see the trauma, especially with June, as I've talked about briefly in the paper. We don't see pretty much any of her life at all before the war and before the trauma really affects her character. We get a slight hint that she was maybe a much more like quiet, shy, kinder girl before these violent instances turned her, for survival's sake, into a very violent person. So I think The Surrendered, but also Book of Night Women, really does a good job of showing the conflicted nature of a violent person, how people do not, at least these characters aren't acting violently out of any sense of choice, but more out of a response to the violence they themselves have experienced.
Yes, and also in the Book of Night Women, you not only see Lilith and her regrets for committing violence, which was even often committed in self-defense, but you also see how the slave owners react as well to violence. They have to constantly convince themselves and one another that what they're doing is correct, what they're doing is right. Even the master at Culebra, which is the second plantation that Lilith works at, he is constantly saying how slaves are just animals, you cannot trust them. But at the same time, he was the character in the book that sexually violated slaves the most. So on one hand, he was saying how slaves were less than animals, they were almost property, like a chair, inanimate objects, but at the same time, you wouldn't have sexual relations with a chair that openly anyway. And so there's a lot of confliction with that as well. And you see the fear as well in a lot of the slave owners, whether it be the overseers or the headmaster, they're constantly talking about possible revolts. They're arresting slaves or torturing them if they have any objects associated with voodoo or obe, which was closely associated with slave revolts as well. And there are also many points in the novel where a bunch of British troops are marching around. And so that also shows the tension of the time and the feeling of imminent revolt and collapse, because the book actually takes place a few decades before slavery is altogether abolished in Jamaica. Thank you for the question.
Other questions? Carol?
Yeah, so you're asking the self-autonomy and self-ownership as a response to the violence. In effect, is that recompense, you said? Is it? Yeah. I think that both books have such extreme examples of violence, and I'm very sorry for this being a very downer of a talk and a discussion, but yeah, because both of these books dealing with such violent atrocities, it would be interesting to look at maybe other examples in literature or even in real life of people that have gone on after these events to live fairly normal lives. Actually, now you mention it, we actually had a discussion in the class somewhat about there's some references to this life that June has lived between having come to America And the point that we find her at the beginning of the book as dying of cancer and kind of reflecting on her life. And there's this like small reference to she had a husband, she had children. For all we know, she had a very, normal, fulfilled life. But the book completely skips over that. And personally, I was a little frustrated with that because I think that it doesn't do justice to, just like you were saying, the idea that people can, own their lives even after receiving trauma and not, be constantly stuck in a state of victimhood. So for The Surrendered, I guess is not the novel you want to look at if you want to talk about ownership and, healing and psychological healing from trauma, because it's very much focused more on the trauma.
And also, with the Book of Night Women, as well as the desire for autonomy coming from the loss of freedom, you not only see that in slaves, but you also see that in Isabel, the lover of Master Humphrey. She sometimes sneaks off at night dressed up as a man, and she rides a horse like a man, and she goes to bars where she has some kind of alcoholic beverage, which name escapes me at the moment, but she was very, very into that and getting very, very wasted on a daily basis, and it was a secret. So you not only see the desire for autonomy and the desire for freedom from slaves, but also from, in this novel, the women, and you also see it in certain ways from the male slave owners as well. They're constantly in a feeling of fear and agitation, and at the time when Lilith burns down Culebra, and she says that she had nothing to do with it, she was milking the cows, she didn't hear anybody screaming. By the time she tried to come and help, she was fire broke out and she was injured in the process. She had a very intricate story to save herself. The master is crying, he breaks down, and he's like, "Oh, you just want to kill us, don't you? You just want to kill us." So on one hand, you see that desire for autonomy strongly from the slaves, but you also see bits and pieces of it and reflected in different ways in nearly all the characters of the novel as well. And you see how the institution of slavery and also the restrictive even gender roles hurts not only the people being oppressed, but the oppressors as well. Yes, his name was Quinn. Yes, and he even became close friends with Lilith. He was very kind to her. She was torn whether as to actually she loved him or not, because in a situation like that, he obviously has all the power in the relationship. She cannot say no. But he claims that he was an Irishman, and he also suffered as much as her, and how the Irish were the slaves of the English. So he tries to identify with her, whether just righteously or not, but we see nearly all the characters suffering from this loss of liberty and rights as well.
One last question or another question?
Yes. Well, I have one comment.
We actually have plenty of time, sorry.
Okay. I had a comment about you were referencing the circle. What you said, it was
The circularity of slavery.
okay. And I was thinking actually, of course, in the class of the novels we were talking about in terms of so many circles. Talk about you try to oppress someone after you are also oppressed. Part of being prisoner, somebody at the guard, the friend, the fear. And then I was also, I find it interesting that the piece
I'll go ahead and start with that because, again, I'm very bitter about that, the lack of discussion of that in the Surrendered. So to repeat the question, what are the long-term effects of trauma, and how do those affect someone's ability to have a quote-unquote normal life, to be able to be, functioning and not suffering psychologically from that trauma. So again, like I said, there's all sorts of allusions in the Surrendered that June had maybe not a normal life, but a life that was full of, a husband, several children. She's living in an apartment, functioning in all senses of the word of, being able to hold down a job, being able to have relationships. But because the novel doesn't describe any of those instances in her life or say anything about them except for in the first chapter of the book, we have no idea what her mental process is. And for a book that is so invested in the mental and the psychological and thought processes of this character at every other moment in her life, I think it's interesting and a little disappointing from a curious reader's perspective that the book doesn't give us any insight into what her life was like beforehand. The book, it does have a sense of peace and closure by the end, whenever June sort of goes on this journey of finding peace. She goes back to not to Korea, actually. She goes to Italy for. You'll have to read the book for it to make sense. But she goes on this journey kind of closure. So by the end of the book, that very end of her life, she does find a sense of peace. But as far as the rest of her life, we have no idea, unfortunately.
And dealing with that question with the Book of Night Women, even the people who were in power and supposedly had normal lives, a lot of them towards the end of the novel didn't have as normal of lives. For example, Master Humphrey, his mother was killed, his best friend Quinn was killed, and he eventually leaves the plantation because he can no longer stand being there, and he actually leaves Isabel, who is pregnant with his child, behind, although he accuses her of having someone else's child because she was raped, so that was kind of low of him in my opinion. And also he raped Lilith, so there's and she has a child at the end, so we are unsure whether it was his child or Quinn's child. And so on one hand, the people who were in power, they're either dead or they just abandoned the plantation altogether. And Lilith is one of the few slaves who was allowed to live, who was not tortured to death. She, for the most of the part, she misses Quinn a lot. She really was attached to him, and she was heartbroken when he died and trying to save the plantation. She warned him not to go, but he didn't listen, of course, like a good husband, boyfriend, and he died. And her daughter, she teaches her how to read because she learned from the other night women, including Homer, how to read. So she teaches the daughter how to read, and it's also heavily implied that the daughter is the one who actually wrote the book. I'm sorry, spoiler alert. But so on one hand, the daughter is trying to make sense of everything, what happened in her mother's life and what happened even to her grandmother, who was raped when Lilith was conceived, and she's trying to make sense of all that. And after reading the book, you realize just how almost impossible it is to make sense of such a life. Even if it is short, it was compacted with so much violence and indoctrination and just horrific events that you had to deal with on a daily basis. And so it was almost impossible for her to have a, quote, normal life at that point. Even the daughter, who didn't have to live through it, was greatly affected by it. So you see how the violence has like a ripple effect and how it transcends generations even as well.
The Book of Night Women actually has a really good element to it that explores this very question, and we had some lively discussions as far as the relationship, quote unquote, between Quinn and Lilith, and how real can a relationship like that be. did you want to talk much about that? Or, yep.
Well, there was, like she said, a lot of debate. There were some people who believed that it wasn't really a real love or real relationship, because in that relationship, Lilith had no way of saying no at all. She could not defend herself. She could not refuse him in any way. And he kept, after a while, insisting, for example, don't call me Master Quinn, call me Quinn. It took her a very long time to drop the master term. He said, if you don't want to scrub my feet, you don't have to scrub my feet. Say whatever you want to say. He wanted to be very, very close to her. And there was an invisible wall in between them, because she was always raised that if you had a relationship with a overseer or a white man, he was always above you. You couldn't say no. You were never equal. The disparity was just tremendous. So on one hand, there was the power struggle relationship, and it would be like having a job and your boss is constantly harassing you or trying to sleep with you, but trying to be nice about it, in quotes, and you are unable to switch jobs or even put in a complaint about the boss. It is that much of a struggle. On the other hand, he is one of the nicest characters to her in the entire novel, and he is the closest thing she has to a normal life or a relationship in which someone isn't either extorting her or trying to harass her or threatening to whip her if she doesn't do something as quickly, or constantly telling her that she is inferior or stupid or hideous or anything like that. He calls her lovely, which she internalizes, and even calls her daughter sometimes lovely. And so on one hand, we were like, this is an impossible relationship. She has no control over it. But on the other hand, it is the closest thing she has to love in her entire life, because her mother dies during childbirth, and the woman who cares for her does not love her at all. So it is the closest relationship she has to love in her entire life. So at the same time, it cannot be totally disregarded as any other relationship that she has. Would you like to add to that?
No, I think that was good.
So you're sick of hearing questions from me, fair enough. But Hyatt's mom, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but raised this really great question. The violence that people perceive in the media, right, is different than sort of immediate violence, right? You see someone killed in front of you, and that's a different experience. I wonder if either of you, and I know we sort of talked about this almost constantly, right? Wonder where does literature sit in that equation? Like, does literature sit somewhere between the media, the kind of distanced view of the thousands of people dying, and the person in front of you? Deb, you raised the question or you raised the idea that literature sort of intervenes within the media cultures of the 50s. That question is implicit with the Book of Night. Actually, you raised media as well, because Hyatt, you talked about the textbook. So yeah, as a final closing thing, what role does literature play in all this, do you think?
Well, one distinction I would make, incorporating one of the articles of literary criticism we read in the class, as you were talking about, the media, and specifically movies and TV and film. So visual media is very different from written media, and we had some discussions in the class as well about how different they are. But the viewpoint of the literary criticism we were reading was talking about how one picture can be used for completely different political regimes based on the caption you give it, because words are that powerful that they're very good at expressing things that sometimes are lost in pictures. So I would argue that every picture is a form of art in itself, and it's trying to express something, and the way that the artist chooses to picture things, or the filters they use on the light, it's all very constructed the same way that literature is constructed. So I guess very briefly, I would say that literature in any form is trying to relate a story. It's just whether that story is presenting itself in a way that's trying to relate real experiences, or if it's used in a very manipulative way to distance people from the actualities of violence.
And to add to that, I would also say that the background and the experiences of the person greatly affect the effects of the media and what form you are getting this violence in. For example, a soldier who has seen a lot of combat and a lot of people die before his or her eyes will probably be less queasy, for example, around blood or around dying people, as opposed to someone who has never seen death firsthand. And I know that during the Vietnam War, one of the main factors in stopping the war was the photos and also the introduction of color photos, because you can never capture the reality and the realness of blood, for example, if it's just in black and white as opposed to vivid red and all kinds of other colors as well. But unfortunately today we are so bombarded with pictures and videos and newscasts about the homicide that happened. We are in a way kind of desensitized to this photo reaction in a way. And I think literature these days is kind of, because less people unfortunately are reading, it's becoming a more powerful way of showing violence, because more people unfortunately are more likely to watch a movie, for example, as opposed to reading a book about war. But with literature, you follow the same characters throughout their lives, no matter how short it is. You are forced to empathize with the characters. It could be a book about a Nazi soldier, but you will feel his sadness, you will feel his frustration and his pain. And no matter who the character is, and I think this is a very important thing about literature, it allows people who often don't have a voice to have voices and to express their emotions and their experiences. And because you are forced to visualize what is happening to them, you sometimes not only see when someone gets shot, you can hear their cries in your head. You can maybe smell or feel how they're like their coat when it's falling or something like that. You are more involved in creating the scene in your head and experiencing it through your senses in your mind. So I think the violence could almost be more personal in that sense, and I think it could be the closest thing you could get to besides experiencing it firsthand in the person, and I think it's very important.
Great. Well, thank you so much for these wonderful talks. Thank you all for attending. Please come back. Sharon Robb, the founder of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, is speaking right on this very stage at 4 o'clock. That'll be a great talk. There is an exhibit not too far from this theater in the Stein Gallery called Visions of Conflict. Lots of really great art from 5 artists who deal with conflict on a really intimate basis. So yes, thank you very much.